So now we have Tim Jones. Tim Jones was an air cadet here as a very young lad. I remember him wandering around the place, all dressed up in the Air Force uniform, looking very smart. He got his commercial licence and then flew locally throughout Western Australia with a number of lower level operators. Hicks Aviation was one. Got himself into all sorts of strife in country centres, and then he joined the RAAF, spent some very interesting years in the RAAF, and then went to Qantas, retired from Qantas, and is now farming on a lovely little property in Queensland. And so, Tim, would you like to step forward and tell us something about what you've been up to?
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. A little bit of a story on the Australian production of the F18 Hornet. In the mid-80s to the early 90s, 71 of the Australian F18 Hornets were actually built in Australia. My story comes from my involvement in that program, which is, I was involved in about the middle 2/3 of it. I wasn't there at the beginning or the very end. And my job was as a factory test pilot to test the aircraft and deliver them off the production line, both in America and here in Australia. It's not really a history. I'll give a little bit of the background as I remember it, but some of the dates and figures might be a bit approximate because still from my memory, not really a direct history. Australia's always built aircraft, mainly because up until about World War II, it was not possible to fly them here. So we ended up getting foreign-built aircraft, and usually they were taken apart and brought across on a ship and then put back together. Early example. From there, Australia then went to licensed building aircraft, which was essentially to take foreign designs and then build them in Australia. And we made total aeroplanes there. And a couple of the good examples of that would have been in World War II, where Australian manufactured Beaufighters and Mosquitoes were operating. When it was necessary, we actually designed our own aeroplanes, an example of which is the Boomerang, which was designed and built in Australia. Probably our best results came by modifying an existing design and improving it. So we took probably what was the world's best post-war day fighter, the North American F-86E Sabre jet, and improved it with Cannon Sidewinder missiles and British design but Australian built Avon engine. And we probably made the best of the best day fighters. Day fighters obviously are limited to daytime, and into the 1960s there was a need to go to night or weather capable aircraft, so we ended up buying the French Mirage, which again was built in Australia. It was licensed built and pretty much exactly the same as the French Mirage 3E. In the early 70s, consideration was being given to a possible replacement for the Mirage, and we had various delegations from the RAAF go overseas and have a look at replacement aircraft. Era was 1973 or thereabouts. Money was tight and no decision was made. We actually had another replacement aeroplane that we could have perhaps used to supplement the Mirage. Unfortunately, it went back to America when the F-111s arrived. In the few years after that, the American Air Force was looking to replace the Phantoms that they had, and also to replace the Lockheed F-104s in NATO in Europe. And so they ended up having a competition for a replacement fighter. And the winner of that competition was the General Dynamics YF-16. And that went into production in America as the replacement aircraft and was produced in quite large quantities for NATO and the Americans and for other organisations. Loser of that competition was the Northrop YF-17. Coincidentally, around this time, which was sort of 1975, 6, around that area, the United States Navy was looking at a replacement aircraft for its F-4 Phantoms, F-14 Tomcats, and its ground attack aeroplanes, the A-6 and the A-7. So what happened was that Northrop the company combined with the McDonnell company to try and turn the YF-17 into a carrier-capable fighter. And the result of that was the F-18. If we have a look at the F-18, we can see the direct derivation from the Northrop F-5. Northrop had no experience with aircraft carrier-borne aircraft. McDonnell had a lot of experience. They'd been in the process of building 5,000 Phantoms, and they had previously built carrier aircraft. In the late 70s, we in Australia sent more delegations overseas to chase up a replacement for the Mirage, because the Mirage at this stage had had its life extended probably beyond what was reasonable, and we were starting to get an increasing accident rate from wear and tear and component failures. The shortlist ended up being 3 aeroplanes that were flown by Australian pilots in evaluation. That was the Mirage 2000, the F-16 and the F-18. The Mirage 2000 supposedly was the nicest one to fly, but was not as capable as the American aeroplanes in regard to cockpit design and radars and weapon systems. So it was eliminated, and the competition for our replacement fighter fell down to the F-16 and the F-18. The F-16 was still just a day fighter. It did not have a radar-guided missile, and the F-18 was a fighter. It had no ground attack capability. So Australia deferred its decision for another year, and the Americans actually developed both those aeroplanes. The F-16 got a radar missile, and the American Navy needed a ground attack aircraft for the Marines and the Navy. So the F-18 became the F-A-18 with a ground attack capability. Australia eventually made the decision that we would go with the F-18, partly because it had 2 engines. The F-16 was a single engine aircraft, and we wanted twin engine reliability, and partly because as a carrier-based aircraft it was actually very robust, which possibly suited deployment bases in Australia. There was also a decision that it could actually be produced in Australia. In the meantime, it went into production in America in a big way. It was being produced for the United States Navy, the United States Marines, Canada and Spain. And the production line was in St. Louis, Missouri, in the Midwest of the United States. At the same time, McDonnell Douglas there was producing both the F-15 and the Harrier, so it was a pretty busy factory. We're just going to produce the F-18, and it was going to be done under what the Americans call a foreign military sales scheme, where the aircraft was actually owned by the Americans until it was finally delivered, which was exactly the same as what was going on in St. Louis. St. Louis was certainly an interesting place to operate. It was Lambert Field, the main civil airport in St. Louis, and with the production of those aircraft it was very, very busy with that. It also had a US Air Force squadron of Phantoms was based there. It was the headquarters for TWA, a major international hub and a major domestic hub with pretty much every sort of civilian aircraft coming in, commuter airlines for around the Midwest, and they were operating 2 parallel bitumen runways, big ones, a 3rd parallel runway for the commuters and a cross runway, and it was underneath the airways into Chicago, so it was a very interesting place to fly F-15 and F-18. The first 2 Australian Hornets were built there at St. Louis, and they were actually tested and flown at St. Louis and then handed over to the RAAF in the States. Our aircrew took them across to California, continued some training with them, and then eventually they were ferried across the Pacific in around about a 12-hour flight with, I think, 15 air refuelings, which was a fairly massive thing. We went into production then in Avalon, in Victoria, near Geelong. The airfield was there, and the Australian aircraft were essentially built exactly the same way as they were built in St. Louis. The fuselages were built by Northrop. The centre fuselage section was built by Northrop in California, And in the States it went on a railway car to St Louis. In our case it went on a ship to Melbourne. Pretty much all the rest of the components, including engines, were built in Australia, mainly at the Fisherman's Bend in the government aircraft factory, and then they was assembled in exactly the same way as the Americans did it. One of the interesting things there is that under the foreign military sales setup, the aircraft were actually American civilian aircraft until they were actually delivered to the RAAF. And so when flown in Australia, they were actually American aeroplanes, and they were civil aircraft. This did lead to some issues, particularly with the second two aircraft that the RAAF bought, which were also made in St Louis. They were flown in St Louis, then taken apart and flown across to Australia as cargo in an American cargo aircraft, and then reassembled in Australia. Unfortunate example of Australian industrial attitudes. There was a demarcation dispute about who was going to fly it and when, and the first flight of the third aircraft, which was the first one assembled in Australia, was actually delayed while they argued about that. Was it a civil aircraft? Was it a military aircraft? Was it American? Was it Australian? The answer was pretty difficult, and this question actually sort of dogged the whole program right through. The production was organised by McDonnell Douglas, the factory in St Louis. It was contracted out to the government aircraft factory in Australia to build them, and it was overseen by the American Department of Defence, who had delegated the United States Navy to supervise it. So there was all sorts of questions in and out and who and what. The initial production in Australia was all the F18B, which was the two-seat version, and then it went into production of the single-seater. And the first one's going to number 3 Squadron at RAAF Base Williamtown near Newcastle. The aircraft were test flown pretty much in that configuration, the only exception being the Sidewinder missiles were not fitted. The launch rails for the Sidewinders were an integral part of the aircraft, so they were on it there. Typically, the test flights and the production, in fact, all of the production in Australia was done under the same principles as in the United States, and the test flying was done the same way. The requirement was to have 2 independent pilots run the aircraft through all of its envelope, and then to verify the integrity of the airframe, the engines and the aircraft systems, and then to verify the performance of the weapon systems, everything short of actually firing guns or dropping bombs. Typically it would take about 4 flights before the aircraft was considered to be completely finished. Typically again it would be a requirement to test engine relights, so engines were shut down, relit at the edge of the relight envelope to prove that that was correct. It would also require checking the rigging and the handling. The aircraft was actually limited to 30 degrees angle of attack in the flight manual. In the test we actually used to take them to 55 degrees angle of attack, mainly to check the rigging and the stability of the aircraft, and it flew amazingly well. It was directionally a little less stable above 30 degrees, and you could feel it wanted to waffle a little bit sideways, and then as the angle of attack increased, then the aircraft stabilised again. We also flew it supersonically, so it was taken to its maximum speed. In America, above 30,000 feet, there were no limitations on where you could fly supersonic, so there was not a problem there. In Australia, we were not allowed to do it over land, so the result was we had to do all the supersonic flying across Bass Strait, which was an uncomfortable feeling in winter. And I, in fact, used to confine my over Bass Strait flights to in the morning only, because I don't think if you'd ended up in the water you would have survived the night. Generally speaking, the aircraft were in very, very good condition when we started to fly them. The design principle in the factory was to use semi-skilled labour and very experienced and skilled supervision to oversee the construction of the aircraft, and they had very good end-to-end test gear to make sure that everything was working pretty well. I think the build standard in Australia was probably slightly better than in America. I think mainly because we used qualified tradesmen rather than semi-skilled workers, but we were also much slower at doing it. The Americans were much better than we were at actually rectifying any defects. So any defects that we found in the test flights, the Americans had the experience base to be able to fix them pretty quickly. It usually took our blokes a bit longer. But the end result was exactly the same, very good aeroplane. In the test flights, we always had a support aircraft. We called it a chase, which is probably a bit generous to the Mackie, but nonetheless, the requirement for the chase was to actually have another aircraft be able to have a good visual look at you if something had gone astray. Didn't happen very often. The aircraft, the Hornets were in very good condition when we flew them, but occasionally the chase aircraft was absolutely invaluable, and the Mackie was really quite good for that because it could slip round. If you're in the Hornet, you slow down, Mackie slips around, has a look at you. And we've had a couple of incidents in the testing where it was very, very good to be able to have the chase pilot have a look and say, okay, no, you're not really on fire, it's a false light. And one I had in the States with a Spanish aeroplane where the boarding ladder actually came down. And it was very good to be able to have a chase aeroplane say, okay, well, it's only come down about a foot, nothing's fallen off. So the chase was invaluable. The other thing we used to use the chase aircraft for was when we got to the later flights, and that was a requirement to check that the weapons systems and the radar on the Hornet was correct. And the chase aircraft, the scientists had worked out exactly the radar signature, so we knew exactly what range we should be able to pick it up. And so we used to test the radars to make sure that the detection range was correct and the radar was performing. So that was the other reason why we had the chase. While I talk about the radar, the Hornet had an air-to-ground mode on the radar which would pick up moving traffic on the roads or tanks in a paddock if you happen to be looking for that. But in the test case, I used to look at trucks travelling along the highway between Melbourne and Hamilton. And you would be perhaps 10, 15,000 feet and quite a few miles away from where it was, so the truck would have no idea you were there. And the radar display showed a line of trucks, vehicles moving along the highway. So the technique was to actually just lock one up on the radar and then just follow it in and make sure that the weapons delivery site actually bracketed the vehicle. And one of the things too that showed up, there was a speed readout of what the vehicles were doing. And it was interesting that every time I locked up one of these trucks, it slowed down. So I'm suspecting they probably had fuzzbuster anti-police radar detectors in the trucks. It was certainly an interesting bit of flying, testing those aircraft. The final flight on the aircraft was actually done in this configuration. You can see the sidewinder launch rails there without the weapons on it. That's exactly how the aeroplane looked. And we flew the last flight with the ferry tanks, the external fuel tanks on board, and it was really mainly a clean-up flight, any minor defects that were left on the aircraft, and to ensure that the fuel tanks fed symmetrically, and there was no problem with any of that. If you have a look at the aircraft, it's nice and shiny and new, and it was just lovely to be able to have the opportunity to fly in aircraft that had been beautifully built and presented very well. And I think one of my biggest senses of satisfaction would be the aircraft that I actually delivered 30 years ago are still operating in the Middle East right now. I would have to say that I think the Hornet was one of the nicest aircraft I've had the privilege to fly. It was an easy aircraft to fly, very well balanced flight controls, and a reasonable amount of power, and a very good compromise of systems and instruments in the aircraft. That's pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm happy to field any questions. Go ahead.
What's your personal view of the F-35?
Well, that's a very good question, and the answer to that is I left the Air Force about 30 years ago, and so I have not looked in the rear vision mirror, and I've not been privileged to be part of the discussion on the F-35, so I really can't answer that. I guess I can make the same observation that most of us can. Extremely capable aeroplane that cost a lot of money. Every aircraft in military aircraft has always been a step forward from the previous one. Obviously the occasional aberration sneaks through, but generally speaking the Sabre was better than the Boomerang. The Mirage had more capability than the Sabre, and on. And in my time there, the Hornet was certainly at the forefront, as were other aeroplanes, but I think the US forces have very happily used the Hornet, and they generally seem to know what they're doing in that regard. I mean, the aeroplane has lasted well. The Super Hornet came along, and the Super Hornet, in fact, it's called a Hornet, but the only reason they called it a Hornet was to get the funding through Congress. It really is a bigger, better and different aeroplane. But the American budgetary system said, let's call it a Hornet, we're more likely to get it through, and that's what happened.
Can you make any comments on the quality of the top-of-the-line Soviet new products that the critics are saying are so good?
I think we all heard the question. The answer is the same as what I gave before. I'm out of touch with that. I can say that I worked with an Indian Air Force pilot who flew the MiG-21, and he flew the MiG-21 in action against the Pakistanis, and his comments on the MiG-21 were it was a very good aeroplane. And he was quite familiar with Western aircraft as well, having flown Hunter and Lightning, and I think Harrier. So I think his comments are probably valid. The Soviet aircraft at the time were tractor built but very capable. I wouldn't think it would be much different now.
Okay, with the Hornet, what was its external fuel configuration? How many tanks could you take, and how well did it handle under that situation?
In the ferry configuration, the Hornet would normally take 3 fuel tanks. It handled quite well. It was an aircraft with a good lifting wing with a full span leading edge flaps, or leading edge slats, flaps, whichever way, and full span trailing edge flaps. So it had quite a bit of capability there. It had good handling in that all of the flight controls would do whatever was required to get the aeroplane to fly, and the handling was quite good. But on the other hand, I'd have to say it would be very rare to need all those fuel tanks with the modern capability of air refuelling. The flight of the first 2 Australian aircraft from California to Australia was, as I said, around about a 12-hour flight with 15 air refuelings. That was probably stretching it a bit, but we used to deliver the F-18s out of St. Louis to wherever the end user lived. Around America it was easy, up to Canada, again no problem, but across to Spain it was again an overwater flight. It was a transatlantic flight with about 5 or 6 hours and 5 refuelings, and again no problem, and that was what the aeroplane was designed to do. So there was very rarely a need to load it up with external fuel tanks. And the external stores position were probably better used for weapons. You can see the result there. The stuff that can be hung off them is just amazing.
The F-111, did you ever have anything to do with them?
Yes, I flew the F-111 for 6 years. That answers that question. Was it a good aeroplane? Yes. Was it an F? No, it was a bomber.
How could you qualify for that very prestigious job you had? You must be extremely competent.
How did I qualify for that job? The story is that I was called up for national service into the Army, and I was getting letters from one Murray Dixon, whom some of us here would know, who was not enjoying his army time, and I thought, this is probably not for me. So I went round the corner to the Air Force and said, what are you blokes offering? And they said, you've got to sign on for another 5 years, but you never know what might happen. And so I was lucky.